Amber Hannah. I am the Dean of Kent State University Libraries, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here tonight for our program featuring the authors of A Century of Flight at Paton Field, the story of Kent State University's airport and flight education. It's interesting that I have more than a few personal and professional connections to Paton Field, its authors, and this book. As an undergraduate at Kent State in the early 90s, I worked at this airport, first as a flight line technician, and then also later as the overnight housekeeping guy. During that time, this was the time when Eugene Ripple was the airport manager, Dennis Baden was, I think, running operations. I worked with another student that you can read of in the book. Her name was Sarah Deal. She's now known as Sarah Deal Burrow. And she went on to become the first female Marine pilot in our nation's history. So flash forward about 15 years, I come to work at Kent State University, and I meet and work closely with one of the authors of the book, Barbara Schloman. And in fact, I consider Barbara one of my most important mentors in my career. Move a few more years into the future. It's 2016, and I find myself the interim director of the Kent State University Press. And it's at this time that this book project came into the press. So when I look back at those years, you never would know these connections would have meaning, but it's interesting how life shows us the synchronicity of meaning in our past. So I'm proud to have these connections and proud to have just a little bit to do with this book coming forward. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to thank a few people who made tonight's program possible. Of course, the College of Aeronautics and Engineering, and in particular, we want to thank Associate Dean Robert Krause. Thanks also to Airport Manager Dave Paluga. Dave, thank you for your ongoing support. I want to thank Mary Lovin from the library's event team for helping do some of the logistics around the event. Finally, I want to thank Susan Wadsworth Booth, the director of the University Press, and her great staff for not only helping make this event happen, but for their great work and commitment in bringing this book forward for publication. So, just a little bit of how it's going to work tonight. We'll have a presentation from our authors. Then we will have some time for some questions. After that, we'll retire to the lobby where we can talk with the authors, buy books, enjoy some refreshments. Okay? So, it's now time to introduce our authors. They are a proud mother and son duo. The mother, Professor Emeritus and former Associate Dean at Kent State University Libraries, with a passion for research and history. Her son, a graduate of Kent State's flight program, and a passion for that program and the history of that program. They began investigating their passions, working together, and uncovered a compelling 100-year history of the airfield that would become known as Paton Field, while at the same time chronicling the evolution of Kent State's flight program. They interviewed over 70 key individuals, and of course they researched and collected hundreds of primary and secondary resources to help tell their stories. So as I turn things over to our authors, let's imagine that they've just landed on the runway outside after taking a long journey through the history of the airfield in Kent State to share their great story with us. And that is the great story of this airport and Kent State University's flight program. So please join me in welcoming Bill and Barbara Schloman.
Thank you, Ken. There aren't many times in your life where you're going to have two Schlomans in front of you, let me tell you that. But this has been quite a great working partnership, Bill bringing the pilot side, and then I, as the librarian, bringing some research experience. So the project began after discussion with Dave Paluga, airport manager, and his interest in preparing for the airport centennial. and wondering what we might do to help uncover some research to explain the history. And so that was where it all started. So we began by looking at existing airport histories, which went back a couple of decades. And what we found was there were inconsistencies and things that could not be verified. So our first goal was to try and clarify the historical record. We were lucky because we're in an age where there's a multitude of print and digital resources, and we drew upon those. So here are some examples of the kinds of things that we tried to ferret out. And so one story that is prevalent is that the airport served as a ferrying space for Curtiss Jennies that were being flowed through from Canada on their way to the southern part of the US. And the story is confirmed by the Curtiss Museum. No, that did not happen. But we do believe that in 1917, there's a good chance this was a landing field, as many farm fields were. That in 1930, the hangar is represented today in the maintenance hangar in some form. And that's not true. We know that that hangar was completely destroyed by fire. But the one that is there today may be on the footprint of that earlier hangar. And then another story that's really prevalent is that Lindbergh landed here along with Floyd Bennett and Rickenbacker. And we are quite certain that only Rickenbacker landed here of those three. But we did find that Clarence Chamberlain and Billy Mitchell were here. So we found a couple of other gems to replace them. So this was a 4-year project, as Ken indicated. We looked at many primary source documents. We were able to collect a lot of photographs. And we were very touched that we were able to connect with over 70 people who had a direct connection in one way or another with the airport. So all of this research led to the book, but it also led to a big reveal for us. And that is that this is, we are convinced, the longest surviving public use airport in Ohio. The only two that are older, one military, the Wright-Patt Air Force Base in Dayton, and the other corporate, the Goodyear Blimp Hangar in Mogador. So what follows are highlights from that history that we uncovered and the people who ensured the airport's longevity. The field has had 3 owners. The first, Reverend Edward Smith, he was a Methodist minister who had served in a number of churches in northeastern Ohio. He was a proud veteran of the Civil War, and he often spoke of his experience as a prisoner in Confederate prisons. From the late 1800s into 1900, he bought parcels of land, and the contiguous piece that he put together in Stow created what was considered to be a model farm. That included this imposing house, which he called Kentview. It sits on a knoll, and Smith would speak of the magnificent view it provided him of Kent and the new normal school. And for us tonight, it is, of course, Cellar 59, right next door. So in 1919, Reverend Smith leased 80 acres of his farm to the Ohio Flying School and Transport Company. It became an operating airfield the next year with a hangar and 5 planes. It was also a stop on the interurban railway, which ran along Kent Road, connecting Akron, Kent, and Ravenna. economic downturn forced the airfield into foreclosure in 1921. So Reverend Smith and his son Fred determined to continue operation of what by that time became known as Stow Field. Fred was a prominent politician in Summit County and well placed to promote the airfield. He would manage it for much of the 1920s and was its owner when it was sold to Rudy Vandermeer in 1940. One thing that was of great interest to us was that during the period of the 1920s, the airfield served as Akron's airport. Although Stow only had a population of 1,200, Akron's population was 208,000. It did not have its own airport and did not get one until 1929. So on this federal bulletin that you see on the screen, Stow Field is labeled as Akron Airport. This is a 1928 guide. Because early aviation lacked navigation guides, the federal government undertook a mapping project in 1923. Army Air Service flyers visited known fields to map and collect information to produce guides such as we saw part of on the previous slide. Shown here in 1923 are two Army flyers with their de Havilland DH-4 airplane and Fred Smith in the center. In addition to offering rides, flight instruction, entertainment on the weekends, Stow Field was the site of airplane construction and testing. A familiar site was Vern Babcock's airplane called the Teal. It had a 90 horsepower engine and was used in 1925 to set the Stow Field altitude record of 9,200 feet. Here being tested is Guthrie Clark's Dispatcher G3, a single-seat biplane, weighed only 660 pounds, and could reach a speed of 35 miles per hour with its 40 horsepower motor. Dazzling, yes. As the airport for Akron, when big events were to be held, aerial exhibitions, Stow Field was the site. And in 1925, that summer, two major exhibitions were held here. Each was reported to have drawn over 80,000 people. So one of the events that you see here was balloons preparing for a balloon race that would last for 22 hours. These are balloons of a size of 35,000 cubic feet. This was followed that same day by heavier than air events that featured U.S. Army Air Service planes, flying maneuvers, and doing parachute jumping. That same summer, Goodyear brought in its first helium blimp, the Pilgrim, and it was christened here by Mrs. Paul Litchfield, the wife of the president of Goodyear Zeppelin. Today, the gondola is in Smithsonian Zoodvar AZ Center, which is part of the National Air and Space Museum. In 1927, Fred Smith gave over operation of the airport to Hugh Robbins, an enterprising aviator, a former barnstormer, and he would manage the field from 27 through June of 32, when it ended as a victim of the Depression. He was a frequent performer at air exhibitions and a well-known dealer for the Waco planes. When fire destroyed the original Ohio Flying School hangar in 1929, Robbins immediately built a new hangar and located on the west side of the field. So that very first hangar was on the east side. He rebuilt on the west side where we see the hangars today. So this 1931 government map shows Stow Field, the configuration of the runways, the new hangar, and you can see the interurban running along Kent Road. Robbins was the operator of the field when it became a stop on the area's first airline service in May of 1927. The service was run by the Embry-Riddle Company, connected Cleveland to Louisville, with stops in Stow and Columbus. Regrettably, it only lasted 4 months. This is a photo from the inaugural flight. In the white flight suit, you can see Hugh Robbins. To his right is Reverend Smith, the owner of the field, along with others who greeted him that day. Well, who greeted Robbins that day. So at this period in time, the late 1920s, Stow Field becomes part of a regional aviation story that involves it and 2 other airports. So on the area designated A, that's where Stow Field is. B, to the north, in Darrellville, a small hamlet located between Stow and Hudson, is Mid-City Airport, constructed in 1929, closing in 1957. It's on the site, or was on the site, of what today is Joanne Fabrics. Then the C is Akron Municipal Airport. Yep, Akron finally got its airport in 1929, later known as Akron Fulton. This was the same year that Goodyear got the big U.S. Navy grant to build a Zeppelin and would build the air dock adjacent to the airport. So realizing that the center of aviation had shifted to Akron, Robbins wished to have a presence there. And so he created Aviation College. This provided students instruction in airplane construction and mechanics. A student wishing to learn to fly would go to Stow Field. This 1931 aerial shot shows Robbins' new hangar and the field's gas station. So, you know, if I were 3 feet tall.
Okay, hold on. Oh, this is the hangar. That's the gas station, which she's going to mention here shortly.
Yeah. And so, as many of you know, I'm sure that Twin Coach was the bus manufacturer in the city of Kent. And on this particular day, they brought their buses and spelled out Twin on the field. So it was a pretty unusual day. Fire struck again, 1933, and destroyed Robbins' new hangar. That, along with the Depression, caused Stow Field to go into receivership until it was purchased by Rudy Vanderveer in 1940. Bill.
Wow.
Just saying.
All right. All right, so our research found that would take Kent State 20 years to establish a flight program after beginning started with contracting out flight training using several different airports and having limited access to their own airport eventually. So Kent State's entry to flight training started with the Civil Pilot Training Program. It was FDR's New Deal for aviation in America. It partnered colleges and universities with local flight training providers to give free pilot licenses to students. After the start of World War II, this morphed into the War Training Service, and this was followed by the creation of a college training detachment at Kent State. After the war, World War II and Korean War GI Bills subsidized the majority of the flight training that took place at Kent State. So Adrian Van Wyn was Kent State's coordinator for the Civil Pilot Training Program, the War Training Service, and the College Training Detachment from 1939 to 1944. The Civil Aeronautics Administration recognized his contributions as coordinator and as government advisor for pilot training activities in the region. He was Kent State's first faculty member added to President Roosevelt's $1-a-year man list, where he was paid a nominal salary for his exemplary service in aviation at the time. So Van Wyn left Kent State to join the U.S. Naval Reserves as a lieutenant junior grade. After the war, he stayed on in the Navy's history unit and later became the chief of Navy's aviation history unit. The picture on the right, he's on board the Navy aircraft carrier, the USS Bonhomme Richard, in 1952 to collect material on part of the U.S. Navy and the role it was playing in the Korean War. I like that he took the time, like, but get the picture taken, get me next to an airplane. So, Rudy Vanderveer was a preeminent figure, in the area aviation with its Akron Airways business. Akron Airways operated both Akron Municipal Airport and Mid-City Airport, where it provided flight training for Kent State students in the federal programs. And in 1940, he purchased Stow Field and sold it to Kent State 2 years later in 1942. This was just the airport only, none of the facilities on it, which became problems in later years. Akron Municipal Airport. Rudy's business with Akron Airways had Akron Municipal, which is now Akron Fulton, as the primary base of operation. During the pre-war period, it was used as a secondary training location for Kent State students. During the war, it was used primarily because it had a paved runway with lights so they could land there at night. Goodyear's construction of the Corsair fighter during the war forced most flight training to be moved elsewhere, which kind of ended local flight training at the time at Akron. So Mid-City Airport that we mentioned, which is up near Hudson, was the primary airport used by Kent State students throughout the war, the Civil Pilot Training Program, War Training Service, as well as the College Training Detachment that would follow later. Mid-City Airport closed in 1957 to make room for the General Motors Terex factory, and again, today's where Fabrics is located. So the Kent State Airport, Vanderveer constructed what is now the airport's iconic hangar in 1946. He built the adjacent maintenance hangar, which we know today, which sits next to it in 1945. Kent State did not own these buildings until 1953 and did not have full operational access until 1966. So Stow Field was not the location of any Kent State training during any of these years. Even after Kent State took ownership of the airport, runway conditions were too poor for them to be able to use the airport. So it's important to note that without Vanderveer owning this airport during the war, Stow Field most likely would have been closed permanently. At the time, after Pearl Harbor, a requirement went out that all airports had to have 24-hour security, and most of the smaller airports couldn't afford to pay for that. Since Vanderveer was living here at the airport, you obviously put forth the money to do that, whatever it took. So that basically saved Stow Field from being closed. So these are some of the first pilots to earn their wings during their time at Kent State. Jack Pettit, in 1939, was in the first civil pilot training class at Kent State, and would later be the first to complete the secondary course. Shortly after, he left Kent State to join the U.S. Marine Corps as a fighter pilot. He flew for the Swashbucklers and Fighting Corsair squadrons in the South Pacific Theater. Returning from a mission supporting U.S. troops in Bougainville Island in 1943, he disappeared in cloud cover, never breaking radio silence. He was awarded the Air Medal with 2 gold stars and the Purple Heart. Rusty Kenyon was also in that 1939 CPTV class, the first one at Kent State. He was the second Kent State student to earn their private pilot license. In 1940, he joined the Navy and became an aviator flying the Douglas TBD Devastator as part of infamous Torpedo Squadron 8. In the Battle of Midway, all 15 aircraft of Squadron 8 were shot down without fighter protection during an attack on Japanese warships. He was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest award for combat valor, and a Purple Heart, and the Navy named a destroyer in his honor. So this is now a famous photo of Squadron 8 taken on the deck of the USS Hornet. The blue arrow marks Rusty Canyon. And it's kind of hard to see, but there is a white circle, the gentleman in the middle, that is the sole survivor of Squadron 8, Ensign George Gay. The airmen would also be witness to the launching of Jimmy Doolittle's infamous Doolittle raid from the deck of the USS Hornet in April 1942. So they loaded up the aircraft carrier, they flew out, witnessed that attack, they were returning, and then they were redeployed to go out and fight in the Battle of Midway. So it's an illustration I did of the Douglas TBD Devastator flown by Rusty Kenyon. An historically awful airplane, which is why they were shot down easily by the Japanese. So Director John Ford covered the events of the Battle of Midway for a documentary. After the loss of 29 of the 30 men of Squadron 8, John Ford assembled footage of the airmen that was taken prior to their launch. He gave copies of the 8mm film to 29 families. If you want to watch, it's actually available on YouTube now. So this is a still from that photo. So on the left is Gunner Darwin Clark, and then on the right is Ensign Henry Rusty Kenyon. This is Rusty's wife, Verna, christening the destroyer in his name. And she got pregnant before he left, so his daughter survived, and she provided a lot of this information, which is nice. Wayne Wilkin, he was also in that 1939 first CPTP class at Kent State. He was hired by United Airlines 10 months after his first flight. So, sign of the times. By 1944, he was a captain with American Airlines. During World War II, he flew for Air Transport Command, bringing wounded back from Europe. After World War II, he was hired by captain by KLM due to the shortage of pilots in Europe after the war. So wishing to finish his Kent State degree, he began commuting to Kent between transatlantic flights for classes. So newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic reported his commuting to finish his degree. By 1964, he had made over 1,000 transatlantic flights and would retire as a KLM captain on the 747. So on the left there is Wayne Wilkin in front of his KLM Lockheed Constellation. And on the right, he's at the controls of the Douglas DC-8. Apparently he was so thrilled to fly in an airplane, he named his son Douglas. He provided these photos. All right, two high school friends came to Kent State. Both were accepted into the CPTP in 1941. Richard Dick Schwab and Lowell Buzz Wetzel. Schwab had wished to apply earlier, but was forbidden by his parents for being too young. After Pearl Harbor, both enlisted in the U.S. Army. Buzz, a year ahead of Schwab, quickly found himself off to flight school to become a bomber pilot. Schwab remained at Kent State, awaiting his assignment, becoming a flight instructor at Akron Airway, teaching students and Army cadets. So during our research, we were presented with this event reported by the CAA, or the predecessor of the FAA. Schwab had his flight instructor license suspended. So anyone who knew Schwab would be surprised to learn that he had done anything so egregious to have his license pulled. It would take us 2 years to find out what had happened. So Buzz made local news when it was reported he flew over his parents' house in Crane Avenue with a B-17 bomber on a training flight. The Daily Consider stated he returned to West Palm Beach afterwards, and his bomber was named the Golden Flash. But we learned his bomber was in fact named India Fuhrer Space. Buzz also flew over his newly married wife in her sorority house that sat at the top of the hill on Summit Street. Dick Schwab's Jean was also a member of that sorority, vividly remember girls diving for cover under tables and chairs as Buzz's bomber flew overhead. But in fact, Buzz's actual destination was not West Palm Beach after he flew over Kent. It was to Bassingbourn Air Base in Cambridgeshire, England. So in 1943, William Wyler directed a documentary about the Memphis Belle called The Memphis Belle, A Story of a Flying Fortress. It was filmed shortly after Buzz arrived at Bassingbourn. So in the documentary is a brief shot of the nose art of Buzz's bomber. So from this screenshot, I was able to recreate his nose art. And then further research allowed me to put together a full illustration of the bomber. May 21st, 1943, Interferer Space launched on a mission to bomb U-boat shipyards in Emden, Germany. In this particular mission, his bomber was assigned the position called Tail End Charlie. He was the last bomber in the last squadron in the last group at the lowest altitude. Nearing the coastline, the bombers were engaged with German fighters for 45 minutes. A cannon shell pierced Buzz's bomber, detonating the bombs within and obliterating the aircraft. Buzz was killed in action. 3 crew members would survive the initial explosion. 2 would go on to survive the war. 1 would write a book about his experiences. Buzz's bomber fell near the town of Groningen, Netherlands. And then the search turned up additional resources, including the battle report written by the German fighter pilot who shot down Buzz's bomber. It was translated for us by Kent State alum Michael Everett. Buzz's death wasn't reported until after the end of the war in Europe. Schwab wartime years took him on a different path. He would end up flying transport aircraft over the Himalayas to deliver supplies to China. He survived the war and returned to his wife Jean to start a family. As I was heading out the door after my last visit with Jean as part of gathering research for this book, she mentioned in passing somewhere that she had a letter from the CAA suspending Dick's license. So the story she told was that, most likely inspired by Buzz, Dick decided to buzz his girlfriend's sorority to impress her. At the time, he was only a flight instructor, so he would have used an Akron Airways steerman for the flight. Yeah. So it turns out the government will look the other way when an officer going off to war, but not a lowly flight instructor. So the flight instructor license was suspended as a result. The biggest question we had to answer was how the flight program we know today came into existence. Since 1939, Kent State had relied upon government programs and contract flight training. These are the key pieces we identified of what would become the present-day flight training program. So in 1939, the civil pilot training program began, and the majority of the components were provided by U.S. government and contractor Akron Airways. Students came from Kent State, and faculty administrators provided operational oversight. In 1942, Kent State bought Stow Field, bringing the airport under their ownership, but not the facilities. Bought the airport, but did not get the maintenance hangar. They didn't get the hangar. They had basically just the grass in which it stood. So this lack of access to the buildings at the airport would be a problem for years to prevent the university from turning the airport into an educational facilities as Paton envisioned. In 1943, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. entry into World War II, the civil pilot training program evolved into the War Training Service. Now they focused on creating pilots for the war effort. The War Training Service was eventually disbanded and replaced with a U.S. Army College Training Detachment. Kent State students were no longer used, and the Army cadets were brought in by train. College classroom and instructors were used to teach the required classes to the cadets. 1945, Peyton was rehired to create the first flight training curriculum, and in 1946, classes were finally offered. So for the first time since the suspension of earlier flight training, Penn State students were offered flight training at the university. In 1953, after several failed attempts, Penn State got the funds to buy the facilities at the airport, but they still didn't have access to the facilities. Vanderveer was given exclusive rights to their use. So they finally bought the hangar, and he was allowed to put all of his stuff in it. This is why when you look at the book, there's mention of them, the flying club, having to do maintenance on their airplane. They had to disassemble the airplane, get it to campus to fix it, and then bring it back to the airport to reassemble it because they could not do it in the hangars that Penn State owned. 1966, the last pieces of the flight training program we know today were put into place. Penn State ended their agreement with Vanderveer, giving them the long sought after access to their own facilities. They hired Dick Schwab to be their head flight instructor and got their own airplanes. Additionally, they put an end to the practice of the flying club providing flight training for Penn State students. So we're not sure what airplanes they would have used in the fall of 1966. It's possible that they leased airplanes from the flying club or bought or leased airplanes from Vanderveer. Kent State would buy their first 2 new airplanes in the spring of 1967. So through these years, we were able to identify key individuals who were responsible for the flight program that we see today. Peyton's vision was for a Kent State-run flight program for which the airport would be playing an educational role. He was a part-time CPTP instructor in 1942, again rehired in 1945 to develop the aeronautics curriculum. He was named airport manager. His advocacy for a Kent State program included authoring key documents for the airport study committee that would lead to that outcome. Following his death in 1964, the Board of Trustees named the airfield in his honor. I'd like to point out that they didn't tell his wife until a year later. So. This is Peyton with a student in the Goodyear Duck. It's a 3-seat amphibious airplane. It was donated by Goodyear. It's the only Goodyear Duck ever owned by anyone other than Goodyear. This photo was taken in 1952. Peter Alderson, or I'm sorry, let me back up. Peyton with Kent State Flying Club members in their airplane. He was instrumental in the founding of the Flying Club in 1947, which I believe is still the longest student-run organization on campus. He also served as its advisor. He founded and was the advisor for the flight team, which ended up again just after World War II. And in this photo too, this is the main hangar. You notice that it has a rear door on it. So as we know now, it only has a door on one side. Peter Alderson joined the Kent State faculty in 1953 as an experienced pilot, certified aircraft power plant mechanic. He was a University of Minnesota CPTP graduate himself, and then later an Air Force flight instructor. In 1967, he became director of the new aerospace technology program. And in 1968, his doctoral dissertation was an evaluation of Kent State's flight program. So Kent State restored a Waco aircraft. This is photos on the test flight day, June 9th, 1955. Otterson was the test pilot. We have Peter Otterson with the original Andrew Peyton Airport sign. During his tenure as program director, Otterson dealt with many financial and organizational issues the program and the airport faced. At the time of his retirement in 1979, he was assistant director in the School of Technology. Marshall Garrett was the first student at Stow Field 1938 to get a pilot's license under the new civil aeronautics regulations. He went on to be an instructor and principal at the Akron School of Aeronautics. He joined the Kent State faculty in 1955 and served 4 years as airport manager. He played a key role in the developing of the 1965 master plan to execute the decision for Kent State to take over flight training. Here is a 1937 at Stow Field with the newly constructed hangar in the background. Again, this is one of the hangars that would eventually burn. Vanderveer would later replace the hangar in 1946. This is the shop inside Van Dusen Hall. Garrett was a certified airframe inspector mechanic. Along with Otterson, they oversaw the Waco restoration, which that's not the Waco, but imagine the Waco. Leonard Mack, 1965, he was Kent State's first licensed flight instructor and examiner. He was also the executive pilot for university administrators. He was chief flight instructor until his early death in 1969. The photo on the right is with his son in the Daimler flight simulator, which was kept in a semi-trailer. Dick Schwab, he was a 1941 graduate of the Kent State CPTP and enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps. He flew the hump in the China-Burma India Theater, and earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. After the war, he earned his master's degree from Kent State, became a local high school teacher and coach, began a long involvement with the Red Cross as a lifeguard and instructor. 1966, he was hired as the lead flight instructor for the new Kent State flight program, and over the years he served as an FAA examiner and was a regular aerobatics performer at local air shows. Over his decades associated with the Kent State flight program, Schwab conveyed his high standards and expectations of excellence to his students and served as a mentor to many, never mentioning once he had his license suspended. So from a 1974 letter to Peter Otterson, from the time the program was established by Mike Garrett, Leonard Mack, and myself back in September of 1966, has been one of which has made me proud to be a part of, and I assure you that I will do all I can to maintain its position as one of the 4 best university flight training programs in the nation. Here's Schwab giving a hand propping demonstration at the airport. And a familiar scene of Schwab with coffee cup in hand for the line service desk. Not throwing girls. So it's through their legacies that we came to understand these gentlemen as the founders of the flight program.
There are other contributors that need mentioning, and Ray Vanderveer was Rudy's brother. He was known as an old-style aviator. There he is. Who loved the flying, but the regulations not as much. In the 1940s, he was his brother's manager of Akron Airways operations at both Mid-City and Kent State airports. Then in 1949, he took over the business at Kent State Airport and operated it under the name of Repair and Sales Depot. Once Kent State got control of its flight and training program in 1966, he became a Kent State employee. This is a moment that many old-time Stow residents still remember, when Ray plane crashed on takeoff in 1959, and it went across the street, landed in a house, destroying the house, and as well as the plane. They both caught fire. Neither Ray nor his passengers were injured, and the lot remains vacant. Eugene Ripple, who Ken mentioned earlier, had a long history here. A former Marine pilot, he began at Kent State in 1967 as a part-time flight instructor, went on to become a member of the faculty, and then served as airport manager for 20 years. His tenure included the writing and execution of the airport's first FAA master plan that resulted in the first major capital improvements at the airport. These improvements in 1982 were the last until the current master plan was realized. So we had decades in there where things did not happen. On the left here you see Ripple is a Marine fighter pilot, which he did for 15 years during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. And on the right you see him participating in the groundbreaking for paving of the taxiway in 1982. Federally succeeded Ripple as airport manager. He learned to fly in the Kent State Air Force ROTC program, and then as an Air Force pilot, he flew the C-130 Hercules transports in Vietnam. He then returned to Kent State as commander of the ROTC program, and later joined the Aerospace Technology faculty and became airport manager. On the left, you see him as a young pilot in Air Force training at Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas, and then as airport manager. Another very familiar face at the airport for many years was Al Beckwith. He was the fixed base operator for nearly 40 years with his commercial aviation corporation business that had a trailer here at the airport. He hired and mentored many students and was an avid promoter for Kent State Aviation. When the airport was threatened with shutdown, both in 1989, again in 2004, Al rallied his colleagues and the community to campaign for its survival. Along with a friend, he built this BD-5 aircraft, and after it had flown for only about 20 hours, they donated it to the Smithsonian, where it's on display in the Utvar Hazy Center. A major theme we found throughout our research was the involvement of notable female aviators who served as models for other women. Frankie Renner was the first. She was hired as a secretary-treasurer for Robin's Flying Service at Stow Field, and that's where she would learn to fly. She was the first woman in the Akron area to earn her pilot's license, and that was followed by her commercial and transport licenses. She performed aerobatics, instructed students, and helped Robins with the sale and demonstration of Waco airplanes. In 1931, she attempted to break the women's altitude record of 27,418 feet. Her 4-hour flight encountered 40-mile-per-hour winds and temperatures of -40 degrees. Although she believed that she had broken that record, it could not be verified due to instrument malfunction. Yeah, good appeal. In 1932, with an interest to engage more women in flying, Frankie and 12 other female aviators formed the Squadron of Death. The name was borrowed with permission from Dick Grace, who was a legendary movie stunt pilot who had a group by the same name. Frankie's group did formation flying and parachute jumping and planned that they would always fly together on Friday the 13th to dispel any idea of superstition. A decade later, Mary Sheriff also distinguished herself with a number of firsts. She was one of 4 women accepted into Kent State's first CPTP class, first woman to solo at Kent State, first woman in the state of Ohio to earn her private pilot license as part of the CPTP, and the first Kent State student to gain employment by virtue of participation in that program. And here's Mary as a stewardess for Pennsylvania Central Airlines. This was the job she hoped for because that was the only airline that did not require stewardesses to be nurses. Ruth Sittler learned learned to fly through the Kent State Flying Club in the 1950s and went on to become one of its flight instructors at 87. She was then promoted to Chief Flight Instructor, Flight Operations Manager. She undertook a doctoral program, and her dissertation explored gender differences in learning to fly. Throughout her career, she was a role model for women, and again, a mentor to many. She and a colleague participated in the Powder Puff Derby in 1969, and they finished third in their category. Ruth would call this a highlight of her career. Mentioned earlier was Sarah Deal Burrows, a student here who went on to become U.S. Marines' first female pilot. As a flight student, she worked the flight line, was a member of Precision Flight Team, and was a flight instructor. After graduation, she was the first woman selected by the Marines to attend flight school, and she earned her Wings of Gold as a naval aviator in 1995. Her deployments have included the Middle East and Afghanistan. She flies the Super Stallion CH-53 helicopter. Here she is in 1989, a sophomore flight student voicing opposition to the possible shutdown of the flight program. Also opposing the shutdown of the flight program was Stephanie Melby Johnson. Stephanie went on to be the first female African-American pilot for Northwest Airlines. After Northwest merged with Delta, she became a first officer on the 757 and the 767. And then in 2016, she became Delta's first female African-American captain. This is Stephanie in 1990 interning at the United Airlines Training Center in Denver.
So we covered a lot of photos and history that didn't make it into the book, so here's just a few examples. One thing we were able to track down Dick Schwab's, so the Piper Cub that Dick Schwab sold it in, 1938 airplane. It still flies, it's owned by a pilot in Wisconsin. Here's a photo of Dick Schwab flying in the Texan that he used for air show performances. This painting is titled The Co-Ed, painted in 1945 by Elmer Novotny. The subject of this painting is Dick Schwab's wife, Jean. Novotny was the head of the School of Art at Kent State and later the Dean of College of Fine and Professional Arts. It was painted at Captain Brady's, later known as Brady's, now known as Starbucks, at the intersection of Main and Lincoln. Painting was last reportedly sold for $9,000. We also discovered that the Kent State Police Department has a framed photo of the drug bust that took place at the airport May 2nd, 2008. Alumni Scott and Heidi Keppel have a scrapbook that is full of an amazing collection of photos and artifacts from their time at One Golf 3. These are photos of Kent 23 before and after it received its Kent State paint job. I don't think Kent 23 is here. What cutlass at 20? I think is your dead cutlass in the grass. Okay. Well, whatever. Not 23. There was a brief period when the hanger sign had a misspelling on it. Alumni Ben Sadisher put the hanger on it to. Dick Schwab's wife Jean shared this photo of him with two unnamed servicemen. So I took the time to colorize it. His uniform presented to Jean. So trying to match the colors of his uniform. The trickiest part was getting his service ribbons. The one on the left gave me the most trouble, is the only candidate I could find was the Distinguished Flying Cross. And as much as Dick liked to share stories about flying the hump, never mentioned that. So the Schwab family requested his military records and verified that he in fact did earn the DNC. So the Kansas City University Airport is unique, not just because of reaching its centennial, but because it had, or has, an amazing story that spans the entire period. Few airports have been around as long, but only fewer have been a part of so many notable events. The fact that this airport flight program has had enough stories to fill a book is something to be proud of. In the end, the people who created this history are what made this an amazing story to tell. We're able to capture the stories of some of those that we personally knew. We're also able to uncover stories of those lost to the passage of time. As a result, the name of the hangar, once again, has meaning. This is Paton Field. That's it. So I know there's a book about it, but if you have any questions about what we said, or even the photos we were sharing earlier?
Done.
Who was the pilot that fell out of the airplane by accident?
That was Rudy Vanderveer. So the story is they got surplus airplanes from the military to do training, and he was going to do a test flight, and he was doing a loop and then fell out during the loop. But he survived. He had a parachute, deployed the parachute. The airplane ended up crashing in a house, not killing anybody or even injuring anybody. And then there was a claim to fame. He joined the Caterpillar Club, I think is the name, for surviving via a parachute. Yes?
Is there a common reason why there were so many of the buildings or hangars that seem to have caught fire?
Bad luck. Well, I would imagine that, I don't know, lack of OSHA requirements, of probably storing of fuel and oils. Like now there's a fuel farm that's underground where they probably just stored it inside in cans, is all I can imagine, and then an erroneous spark or something else led to that, and being made of wood, it probably took a matter of seconds, if not maybe lucky a few minutes before it was gone. So they happened at the worst time. As soon as there seemed to be positive business on the grounds, it would burn down and they'd have to wait for someone to start over, burn down and then start over. But the third one stayed up. Anybody gets the reference?
Bill?
Yes?
Another reason is that sometimes they'd be doping a plane,
Oh,
putting
that's
on
a very good one.
fabric, and that would catch fire.
Yeah.
Some unknown reason.
Yeah. The high volatility of the fumes,
Yeah.
I'm sure that would lead to it as well. Yes?
Now, you said in 1967 KSU bought its first two aircraft. Do you know what the types were of those aircraft? Or no?
It was a 152 and a 150 and a 172. Yeah, because the 152 hadn't come out yet. Come on, Tim. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the role that the airfield played and or did not play during May 4, 1970?
Yeah, so that was something that we were really interested in because obviously May 4th was a big thing on campus and the surrounding community. What role did this airport play in? And we did what research we could, and there's obviously a lot of research out there because it's May 4th. And the best that we can say, something that we were able to verify, is that they moved basically munitions through the airport. I want to say it was tear gas canisters. I think they may have gotten munitions through Camp Perry is where it was. So they basically dispatched small transport aircraft to go get additional supplies and bring them in. There was also helicopters were used to bring in troops, or I guess probably more so commanders or something, and some of those landed on campus. More of those probably landed on campus than they did at the airport. Airport may have provided refueling. So I think as much as we say in the book is that it was the grounds for some activity, some airplanes were doing that. Leading up to it though, one of the big meetings was between the governor, Governor Rhodes, and the university president at the time, who was in Iowa. So they dispatched the Kent State transport airplane, which I think was an Aztec at the time, or an Apache, but to Iowa to go get him, to bring him back. And then the two of them met on the ramp here and discussed whatever they needed to discuss between the two of them. We don't know who the pilot of that airplane is, but we believe it may be Smitty. He's still alive. We're going to try to interview him here in the not too distant future. Maybe he will know. So that's
His 90s.
He's in his 90s and still alive. So I think that is the last connection to the start of the flight program. He came in 67, I think, right after it started. So he may have been the transport pilot for that to go pick up the president. Anything else? The flight students are all here because you have to be here. But taking a bit of advice, or like, go ahead, sorry. Right, so it was 2 years of research, a year of writing, and then a year of editing. The research, we kind of picked our passions, if you will. Barbara focused on the early years. I was more attuned to basically the war years and on. And then finding people, obviously we knew some people, that was the starting point. A lot of the other stuff was just looking at articles and finding a name, and then through magic of your research, we could find surviving relatives. And in some cases, like Buzz's son Buzz was a huge connection with that, because it was, I can't remember how you track that down. I don't know at this point, but we send out a lot of letters. We find people, we think that you are this related to this person. We would include photos and stories, like, do you know this person? Are you related? I got to say, probably 95% of them we got people back. Mary Sheriff's story, all of the stuff from the civil pilot training years. Wayne Wilk and his son Doug had an amazing collection, and everyone was so excited to share their family stories. I think they're sitting on a gold mine. Boy, I wish someone really liked to.
Oh, Joe Vanderveer.
The Vanderveer families, yeah.
That was big. I want to mention Fran Hermans, who's the great-granddaughter of Reverend Smith. And we found you, Fran. It was so great. And so some of the photos we shared today came from her personal collection.
Yeah.
And I would mention two special collections, Kara Gildenbach's here tonight. Just a wealth of information for covering the Kent State years. And we couldn't have done it without the staff there and all the resources they had available. So it was pretty darn dramatic, I gotta tell you.
Yeah. We had a lot of connections. I know even connecting with Schwab's wife, Jean. She sadly passed away 2 years ago, but I still had a solid year. I mean, she invited me into her house. She was living with her daughter. And the photos and the stories, you know, they often said her children would say that her memory was going, but you know, you had mentioned something and she snapped right back to 1942 and knew everything about that. So we're thankful for that. We lost some people. You know, Al Beckwith died not that long ago, and he would have been an amazing person to interview. He would have known a lot more of the ins and outs, but it was a balancing act between what's available via technology online and the people that we lost in the last decade. But the photos themselves are amazing. So, like, you know, most of the photos, well, a majority of the photos that are in the book have never before been seen because they were within private collections. People had them in their house. And like, I know Joe Vanderveer, we went to his house, he had this collage of these photos. Like, can we take that? And we took it off his wall, threw it in the back of our car, took it home, scanned all the photos, reassembled it, and brought it back. So it was amazing to connect with all those people. And this is the only reason why this story doesn't have really any huge gaps, that we were able to go from 1920 fairly comfortably up to present day and have photos and documents and personal stories that did that. I gotta say, you'd be hard pressed to find an airport that you could do that for. I mean, even the biggest of airports, you'd go in and they'd be able to say, well, we built a runway and then we just grew. But what stories took place there? The fact that you have stories here is absolutely unique. Majority of the county airports that are in this state are as a result of, I think it was Rode that did it. And so he basically said he wanted every county to have an airport. That's why we have Wayne County, Portage County, Mahoney, well, not Mahoney, but, every county has an airport. But that's just it. They just built the airport and then that's their history. They existed with that. So this airport predates all of that and has been a part of stuff like the christening of the Goodyear plane. It's involved in the civil pilot training program. Now, I don't want to say that we're the earliest airport. There's a lot more that preceded this airport, but they all went away. This one survived that basically by absolute luck, and most likely because of Vandevier's ownership, that it wasn't bulldozed under like a lot of other airports were late war. Yes?
Currently, how many flight students do you have, and out of those, how many are women?
I don't know. That's a good question for someone that might be in the program now. Any ideas? I've heard a couple hundred, 200.
About 300 students, but I don't know the
Yeah.
demographics.
So the peak was still probably just before they tried to shut down the program. They tried to shut down the program. I think they peaked, is it 400 or 500 was the number? It was significantly higher, but I think at that time it was basically if you can get them, take them. Everybody came, and so they had a lot, and probably more than the program could sustain. So it's sizable now. It probably dipped down into maybe 100 in the lowest points, but it's significantly
How
bigger
many
now.
planes do you have?
33.
33 airplanes.
33 university, about 50 on the field.
Yeah. And the fleet's probably been relatively flat because some of those have been replacements as they've gotten rid of older ones. Maybe it's slightly larger now than it was during that because, a lot of these airplanes, well, in the slideshow that was, the airplanes that you see, or at least that I flew when I was out here, were all bought in the mid-'80s before Cessna stopped making them. And then there wasn't any new airplanes until I left in basically 2000. So for 15 years, there was no new airplanes out here. So the program, the fact that there's a building, this is the third and again, successful attempt at building an educational facility out here. That was Paton's vision. He didn't want it to just be an airport. He wanted it to be an educational facility. You came out, you could be a pilot, you could be a mechanic. You can do it's a one-stop shop for everything aviation. And the biggest problem was that they didn't have the buildings. They kept buying stuff and then giving the ownership to someone else to use it, and it just punished them. You can do that. So the third time was the charm, and this is probably really the true envision, or the final, I guess, vision of what Paton saw out here, where there's Kent State ownership of airplanes and facilities, and I teach classes out here and all that. So it really is kind of like a good footnote to a century of activity. Yes?
Where do you see the future of the airport going?
From this moment, onward and upward, I guess. I guess, our role is kind of playing historians with this, looking at previous downtimes. I'm not worried about a hangar fire. I think we're beyond those. We've gone decades without a hangar fire. But the biggest challenge is going to be probably the university itself. The last, threat to this program was them trying to shut down the airport. And that came not from outside sources, it came from the inside. The leadership at the time saw this as being something they could sell. Real estate was valuable, they could get rid of the land. It's going to take good leadership. I think now that this program is bigger, I guess probably cooler heads will prevail. They have better people that understand what this is. They understand the flight program and what that means to aviation as a whole. I think even when the previous administrations wanted to get rid of the airport, they didn't understand what Kent State Airport or Paton Field meant to aviation as a whole. They were just like, it's no different than us getting rid of the hockey program in the 80s or the bus service in the early 2000s. So I hate to say it, but I think the biggest threat is going to be internal. I think if leadership should change if someone has a different vision for this program. But the fact that this has been growing and improving for now over a decade, it's basically as soon as I left, things got a lot better. Those are connected, but here we are. So if you want me to fix something you got, I'll come in and then I'll leave. So.
I think there's a lot to be said for the administration and the people in the college and in the program who brought it to the point where there was a successful FAA master plan, which is bringing a lot of improvements to the airport. The donation here of FedEx for this building, a really strong enrollment, an economy right now which is hungry for pilots, so that's all good. But there's it's a good moment, and we didn't mention in our presentation, but the airport was the Ohio's Airport of the Year. It was acknowledged for that. That was 2 years ago. And so all of this, right now, things look very sound and very good.
Yeah. Again, I guess if you had to pick an airport to shut down in the state, the amount of awards that this airport is getting or the positive improvements it's seen, it's going to have a lot more stability versus someone that's doesn't have much to show for it. So, knock on wood. Again, I'll leave again if that helps.
So maybe one more question before we retire to the lunch.
Sure. Yes.
Wasn't there a time when they were promoting recreational pilot programs for the public? I don't remember the time, but I remember my friends went through this program and they were really promoting recreational pilots, just to the public so they would get interested in aviation.
I know it happened at least once because it happened during my time here. They kind of tried to open the enrollment to try to bring in outside pilots, and that would even include, or it became an elective that any other student on campus could take. And then I know they kind of try to get outside people, because I know I had one student he was a cop out of Canton that came through here. It never really got a foothold, and it may have been because, to be honest, it's a Kent State airport, Kent State flight training is probably imposing for someone to go, well, I don't think they can teach me there. So I don't know how well it was marketed or something like that, but there was at least once, and they may have tried it before. But I think that is one thing it's kind of another theme underneath it. So you look for something that's going to help this airport in the future, and it's going to be the relationship that this airport has with its local community. The Kiwanis being a part of Aviation Day, or whatever they call it, Heritage Fair, or Aeronautics something or other, they changed names. That relationship is what really helped it during those threats when they came through, especially shutting down the airport, because you could go to the outside source and people that weren't in the program were supporting the program. Hey, I live in the local area and I like having the airport nearby, or I like having this educational facility out there. That is a huge part of it. Like a program like that, letting outside people, like just the local populace come in and learn to fly, kind of helped that, because people can say, hey, I learned to fly at that airport, or something like that. And I think Aviation Day does that. It brings people out, lets them come out and see it more than just they see it driving back on the road, back and forth out there. So that'll be another component to what the future holds, is maintaining that relationship with the general public. They've tried with learning to fly. But to be honest, I can imagine looking at what the costs are for the students now. Oh my gosh, flying is not cheap. So you win the lottery and you want to learn to fly, So anyway, well, that's it. I think I would like to. Before Ken talks, I just want to say thank you all for coming out. We hope that you enjoy the book. I hope it raises questions. I hope if you have something in your personal collection that can fit to it, share it with us. We're always welcome to take anything else that you have. We have more people reaching out with personal stories or photos or whatever. We love to build the collection even more. So that being said,
as I mentioned, we can retire out to the lobby for refreshments and further conversation and get a copy of the book. But please join me again in thanking Bill.